Every year, the richest countries on earth hand out billions in foreign aid. Politicians give speeches, celebrities pose for photos, and we're told that this is how the world finally gets saved. But when you actually ask what 60 years and more than $1 trillion sent to Africa has actually bought, the smiles become a bit more forced. Because the poverty is still there, and indeed, the system was never really built to fix the problem. It was built to keep itself alive. So today, we break down where so much foreign aid money actually goes, the hidden tricks that turn generosity into subsidy for the people giving it, and why Africa might be about to actually grow faster, precisely because the foreign aid switch is being turned off. My name is Nick, and this is the Finance Bureau. Now, most people wildly overestimate how much governments actually spend on aid and have almost no idea where it ends up. In 2025, total global aid landed at $174.3 billion. And the way that figure gets reported is also a bit misleading, because that was not a record high, that was a record collapse. A 23% fall in a single year, the largest annual contraction ever recorded by the OECD. The previous year, the number sat at $215 billion, so more than $40 billion was wiped off of global aid in 12 months. And the United States drove 3/4 of that decline on its own, with the US spending more than halving from roughly $68 billion down to approximately $29 billion after the dismantling of US aid. A 57% cut, the largest single-year reduction by any donor in recorded history. But the more revealing number is who actually receives what is left. You would assume aid flows to the poorest people on earth. It doesn't. In 2025, the single largest recipient of aid anywhere on the planet was Ukraine, taking $44.9 billion, the biggest sum sent to one country on record. Meanwhile, the world's 44 poorest nations received $28.1 billion between them. Put simply, one country at war received more than every other least developed country on Earth combined. So before we even ask if aid actually works, the headline story falls apart the second you look closely. And this brings us to how the money actually moves through the system, because once you track the transfers, the picture gets considerably worse. The path from budget approved in Washington to poor family in rural Africa runs through layers after layers of bureaucracy. Contractors, consultants, international NGOs, UN agencies, each taking a cut for salaries, administration, and overhead along the way. USAID itself set a target of getting 25% of its funding directly to local organizations in the recipient countries. It never even came close. By 2024, depending on who is measuring, the share reaching local partners sat somewhere between 4% and 12%. The rest flowed through Western implementing partners, and audits repeatedly found the system simply could not track where the money ultimately ended up. Think of it as a big charity bucket with a big old hole right in the bottom. By the time anything reaches the ground, most of the water has already been drained into the hands of the people who never needed it. But the most misunderstood part of this whole machine is a mechanism called tied aid. And this is where a donor hands over money on one condition, that the recipient must spend it buying goods and services from the donor's own companies. So the cash never really leaves the donor economy, it loops back home. And the OECD found that this single requirement inflates project costs by 15 to 30% because the recipients are barred from shopping around for cheaper alternatives. For food aid, that premium can climb past 40%. The clearest example is American food assistance. Under the Cargo Preference Act, which is a law dating back to 1954, at least half of all government-financed food aid must be shipped on US-flagged commercial vessels. The Government Accountability Office found this pushes shipping costs up by an average of 23%, adding over $100 million in unnecessary costs to food aid programs. So, a program sold as feeding the hungry, in fact, becomes a guaranteed contract for American farmers and American shipping firms. Aid dressed up as generosity functions as a subsidy for domestic industry. And by the way, if you want to keep up with the stories that directly impact the numbers in your portfolio, you should be reading the Finance Bureau newsletter. It's absolutely free, and we break down everything regarding global finance, commodity markets, macroeconomic trends, and monetary policy so that you never miss what truly matters. All you have to do is click the link in the description or scan this QR code on the right of your screen to get started. And now, back to the machine, because if the money loops back to the donors, you have to ask what it is really buying for them. And the evidence here is uncomfortable, because aid tracks strategy far more reliably than it tracks need. And the cleanest proof comes from a study by economists published in the Journal for Political Economy in 2006. They examined what happened to countries when they won a temporary seat on the UN Security Council, and the finding was striking. During the 2-year term, those countries received on average 59% more US aid, and the moment the term ended, that aid faded away again. The money was simply following votes rather than poverty, and this isn't new either. Throughout the Cold War, aid was an instrument of influence from the very beginning. The Marshall Plan poured $13.3 billion into rebuilding Western Europe to hold back the Soviet Union. The Food for Peace program, launched in 1954, was explicitly designed to dispose of American agriculture surpluses while winning hearts and minds across the developing world. And today, governments have stopped pretending otherwise, describing aid openly as a tool of national interest, from managing migration to securing access to critical minerals. But once you accept that aid serves the giver, you start to understand what it does for the receiver. Because handing a government a stream of money it never had to raise creates a powerful temptation. Large aid flows work kind of like a resource curse. They function much like oil revenue, handing officials a pool of cash that local taxpayers have no claim over and no power to audit. And in conflict zones, the abuse becomes blatant. In Syria, research found the Assad regime captured roughly half of incoming aid budgets simply by forcing agencies to exchange foreign currency at the government's own rigged rate. In Yemen, Houthi forces imposed a 2% levy on aid programs, and they skimmed fees on the top at the ports. In the worst-hit areas, studies estimate that they diverted more than 80% of the aid before it reached anyone. The lesson repeats across decades. The bigger the flow, the bigger the opportunity for theft. Mobutu Sese Seko alone is estimated to have looted around $5 billion from Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, while the aid just kept on arriving. And this is the heart of the entire argument, made most forcefully by the Zambian economist Dambiso Moyo in her book Dead Aid. Moyo points to a correlation, and she is careful to call it exactly this. The peak era of aid flowing into Africa, roughly 1970 to 1998, lined up with a period when African poverty rose dramatically. She does not claim the aid caused the poverty. Her point cuts deeper than this. When a government is funded by foreign donors, it becomes accountable to those donors, not to its own citizens. The basic contract of a functioning state where people pay taxes and demand services in return gets severed. Why build a tax system, a court system, or a competitive economy when the checks arrive from abroad regardless? So the institutions never get built, the dependency deepens, and the aid ends up sustaining the very conditions that justify sending more aid. It's a loop that feeds itself. Meanwhile, the World Bank, despite the image, is mainly a lender, which means poor countries spend decades servicing debt rather than escaping it. Across sub-Saharan Africa, the share of government revenue consumed by external debt payments has roughly doubled over recent years, according to the World Bank and IMF data, squeezing spending on health and education across the region. According to IMF and African Development Bank data, a majority of African countries now spend more on debt interest payments than on public health, a trend that has worsened significantly since 2015. And then there is the food. When free or subsidized produce floods a market, the local farmers, who must cover land, labor, and seed, simply cannot compete with a price of zero. In Haiti, cheap imported rice wiped out domestic production and left the country permanently dependent on imports. And surrounding all of it is a vast industry of consultants, contractors, and administrators whose careers depend on the aid continuing to flow. The accounting now makes the totals look even larger than they actually are, because debt write-offs and the cost of housing refugees inside donor countries gets counted as foreign aid. In 2025, in-donor refugee costs alone made up 13.2% of the global total. Roughly $23 billion booked as helping the world's poor was actually spent at home. Which brings us to the moment everything collides. In 2025, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany all cut their aid budgets at the same time for the first time in around 30 years. By every conventional assumption, this should have been a disaster for Africa. And yet, the IMF expects that in 2026, 11 out of the 15 fastest growing economies on the planet will be African. Ethiopia near 9%. Guinea above 10%, fueled by its booming bauxite mining sector. Uganda above 7%, Rwanda not far behind. The whole of sub-Saharan Africa is now projected to grow over 4%, comfortably ahead of the global average. The IMF and the African Development Bank credit that growth directly to domestic reform, private investment, intra-African trade, and the development of natural resources. A continent that holds an estimated 30% of the world's mineral reserves is finally being funded by trade rather than transfers. In some countries, the loss of aid is functioning as a forcing mechanism, pushing governments to raise their own revenue and build the institutions that 60 years of handouts never produced. And this is precisely the future Moyo called for. She argued for trade, investment, and reform instead of continuous financial transfers. The same path walked by South Korea, by Singapore, and by Botswana, which managed its diamond wealth through strong institutions and refused to become aid dependent in the first place. Now, this does not mean every dollar of aid fails, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. Targeted, measurable programs that bypass corrupt budgets work, and they work spectacularly. The Vaccine Alliance, Gavi, has helped immunize over 1.2 billion children since 2000, saving a record 1.7 million lives in a single year, and every single dollar spent on immunization returns up to $54 in economic benefit. PEPFAR, the American anti-HIV program, is credited with saving tens of millions of lives. These are not the systemic budget support payments Moyo criticizes. They are specific, audited, and built around results, and the current cuts genuinely put them at risk. So, the reality is that two completely different systems have been coexisting under the banner of aid. The era of treating permanent aid as the engine of development is ending, simply because donor budgets ran dry and defense spending took priority. What replaces it is the model success stories used all along. Capital markets, foreign investment, trade access, and governments that finally answer to the people who pay their taxes. The winners will be the African economies that seize this moment to build real institutions and stop waiting for the next paycheck. The losers will be the intermediaries who spent decades profiting from a problem they never actually solved. But the cuts will also hurt vulnerable people who rely on the few targeted programs that actually work. Because that is the cruelty of switching it all off at once. The genuinely life-saving aid gets thrown out with the self-serving aid. If a system has had 60 years and more than $1 trillion and the poverty it promised to end is still there, at some point you have to stop calling it a failure and start asking whether the incentives were ever meant to be successful in the first place. But what do you think? Does the great aid retreat of the 2020s finally force Africa onto the trade and investment path that actually lifts nations out of poverty? Or does pulling the plug this abruptly collapse the targeted programs, keeping millions alive before anything is ready to replace them? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you want to understand how the global debt machine keeps developing nations trapped long after the aid headlines fade, then you can watch our video on that right over here. That's all from me today. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. This is Nick, signing off.